Welcome to Mutually Assured Conversation. I am back again with Thomas777. How are you doing, Thomas?
I'm doing great, Samuel. Thanks for hosting me, as always.
Fantastic. So, in continuation of the last discussion we had, which I think was very fruitful but left a lot of threads unresolved, I thought we could talk about another Teutonic philosopher. So, we are going to try and talk about Hegel today, but we're going to kind of play jazz and see how we go. I've got a lot of directions I could have gone with it, but we're going to see how we get on. I want to preface this by saying I'm definitely at the beginning of my study of Hegel. I would not claim to understand him, would not claim to understand much of the language that is used by people who call themselves Hegelians, but I'm trying. So hopefully there'll be a lot of viewers who are in the same spot as me. I think that'll be quite common. So yeah, I'm not well read I'm not read on Hegel, and I'm definitely a student of this right now. So hopefully, we'll get some more understanding today. So again, like I said, I want to leave this kind of open-ended, and you can go in a philosophical, technical angle with it, or you can talk about world history because I think it fits in there. But yeah, we're going to start this conversation in the same way we started the Schopenhauer conversation. Don't want to put anything into your head, but what is your impression of Hegel, and how does he fit into the grand scheme of things?
Hegel, in my opinion, I'm not saying in absolute terms, so I don't want fellas who are have expertise in the classics to jump all over this statement. Hegel is as important to modern political philosophy as Aristotle. Okay, even people who rejected Hegel outright, even people who are totally committed materialists. I mean, even Marx. Okay, I mean, it's kind of ill understood anymore, the actual relationship between Marx and Engels and Hegel. Marx's repudiation of Hegel basically turns Hegel on its head. Okay, it's something like Carl Schmitt's relationship to Hobbes. Okay, but even more kind of profound in terms of formative influences on Marxist dialectic. So Hegel's a thinker that one cannot escape from. Okay, in continental philosophy. All right, in the modern era. So that's what's key. I came to Hegel through my study of Historicism, like when I was a teenager. And the true kind of underpinnings of revisionism, okay? I'm not talking about kind of juristic objections, to the availing of people who served the German Reich, in court or something. I'm not talking about arguments over details relating to moral or culpability purported, between the allies of the Axis. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about people like Ernst and Nolte, and how they characterized how they characterized the zeitgeist of what Hobsbawm called the short century, the 20th century. Okay, because nobody can really explain that. If you remove God from that equation, providence rather. If you remove the cunning of reason, if you remove, man, or man as the vessel of God's will by way of mind and its capacity to reason from that equation, historical events don't really make a lot of sense at scale. I mean, okay, even if you're not like a believer in God in the traditional sense, the Hegelian view is basically that mind and properties of mind are the prime move-on in history. Okay, even if you take God out of the equation, in traditional terms, you can look at conceptual postulates almost like a meme or something. Okay, that's a crude way to put it, but obviously there's something almost viral about how conceptual paradigms, just people come to accept those things. It's instinctive. It's not just because they all read the same newspaper in 1940 or something, or it's not because there's just some sort of self-interested reason to kind of go along and get along. Like zeitgeist is a real thing. Okay, like what the source of that is, again, like whether you're a believer or not, I don't want to get into that whole controversy today, but that's basically why Hegel is important. Okay, because either you're abiding the Hegelian view in basic terms, often without even realizing it in some cases, or you're in critical dialogue with that perspective, and what you're suggesting are the epistemic priors of people at scale that lead to historical events, are something other than mind and the cunning of reason. So it's not just, I know some people, especially in America, there's a basic, there's kind of hostility to continental philosophy.
Yeah.
And even among like otherwise very intelligent people, but you can't just dismiss Hegel for the reasons why I said. Okay, like the 20th century was a big dialogue on Hegelian concepts. I mean, to say the least. And like Celine said, Louis Ferdinand Celine, like he said, kind of polemically, but it's very true, that Stalingrads were right and left Hegelians like met in this like murderous contest to like settle the historical question for all times. And that's actually very profound. It's not just him being, it's not just gallows humor or something, or some kind of intellectual irony. So we can't really escape Hegel. Even in America, where people aren't even particularly versed in these things. Like, I'm not even talking about the kind of anti-intellectual climate that's come to characterize American government since 1933, if not before. But even people desperately kind of seek out alternative explanations for historical processes. Like, again, like they're doing it contra Hegel, because they're trying to find some unifying catalyst, or some sort of like nucleus of like causative variables that they can just, they can identify as, kind of the basic animating tendency of historical events. That's why sometimes even people who aren't particularly left wing and certainly aren't liberal in any sense, they fall back on some bastardized version, of production force determinism or something, or or they latch on to scientism, because it's like, it's not even that they think that those are such persuasive, that's so conceptually persuasive. It's because what they're doing is they're saying what's like a nucleus of like operative fact, like writ large, that explains, zeitgeist, and that explains, that explains political and historical processes in some absolute sense, that makes it, intelligible or like modelable. I mean, that's the American obsession, is being able to model things. Okay. So that's the short answer. And I should qualify too, so people don't get the wrong idea either about my knowledge base, nor like what I'm like suggesting about that. I'm not some kind of like Hegel scholar. Okay. I spent a lot of time with, philosophy of history. I spent a lot of time with certain Hegelian texts. I spent a lot of time, kind of with reading deep diving into Ernst Nolte, and reading like the hostile dialogue between him and Habermas and things like that. So I mean, that's like where I'm coming from. So if somebody has, figuratively or literally, some kind of like metaphysical question about Hegel, or like how Hegel, like what's Hegel's relationship to Kant's metaphysics, I can't like shed light on that. I'm not some kind of expert in continental philosophy, but I do know something about historicism. I do know something about political philosophy. Okay. And I do know something about how what came to be called the historians' debate, or the historians' controversy between people like Nolte and Habermas in the final phase of the Cold War, that was absolutely a Hegelian enterprise. Okay, that's where I'm speaking from, just so we're clear.
Yeah, so I just wanted to give you, off the back of everything you said there, I kind of want to give you my reading of what I understand so far. So with the Hegelian historical process, it is a linear process with a telos, with a place at the end, which I would suggest contradicts more circular views of history, perhaps. And the Hegelian view is an ascending one that views itself as going towards individual consciousness and individual freedom. Again, like I said, a linear view of history, which is in contrast to cyclical ones. And it is also deterministic in that sense. And to be honest with you, I find the flavors of it, whether you're talking about right or left Hegelianism, it has an innate Teutonic structure to it. It's kind of
you know it when you see it. Yeah, right. Yeah.
It's orderly. And just maybe to suggest what you were talking about in terms of what's against that, I definitely think you have the more Anglo strains of philosophy, such as empiricism, and its sort of bastardized children in neoliberalism, etc., etc. I don't know if you want to comment on anything I said there. I would ask you, and this is more for my benefit and hopefully some of the listeners, I would ask you just to give a definition of what you mean when you say historicism. Yeah, I think that's a good question, I think.
Yeah, by historicism, what I mean is, to your point, what we're habituated to do, not just because it's what we're taught in primary or elementary school onward, but it just kind of permeates the rationalist conceptual horizon. It's what used to be called derisively, like the Whig view of history. History is just kind of this linear process, of improvement, like material and moral and ethical, by which, a combination of technology and, the aggregate and improvement in aggregate knowledge, man can, in his organizational processes at scale, make people more moral, and technology eases, has had the effect of easing these kinds of latent tensions between, different identitarian groups and things, and that, essentially everything subsequent in historical time is an improvement upon all that came before. That's it's history is like this developmental cycle. Okay. The historicist view is that history does not repeat itself. That's asinine, but it doesn't rhyme because we're talking about humans. Okay. And there's certain common epistemic features of humans obviously there's a basically human ontology. I don't mean that means we're all one, or race doesn't matter. Not at all. What I'm saying is that there's whether you're talking about, an African tribe in 1900, that had never encountered the white man, or whether you're talking about, the UK at the zenith of its empire, in the most crude basic terms, there's a basic concept of authority, of, what people's responsibilities are to each other in ethical terms. There's a basic understanding of what war is. There's a basic understanding of economics, even if it's as simple as I will trade you 2 goats for my son to have your daughter's hand in marriage, or vice versa. That's what I'm talking about. So when we're talking about the development of civilizations, there are identifiable cultural forms or civilizational forms. Okay, based upon aesthetic things, based upon, of course, linear biological relatedness, based upon, aesthetical agreements, based upon moral judgments, based upon things, language in common. Obviously, okay. But, the historicist view contra the progressive linear one is that, you're basically just viewing the same process over and over. Circumstances change. The discrete actors involved are all different from each other. The political paradigms that emerge, are premised upon, different things, things in the physical environment and ecology, as well as the intellectual environment, like the inner mind. What a civilizational or what a cultural or civilizational form would prioritize in the 20th century in terms of what it wanted to accomplish. The particulars of that would be different than, say, one in 1500. But at the end of the day, it would be interested in perpetuating itself as long as possible. Expressing its will to power. Guaranteeing the posterity of its people. But it's not this idea that first there was Athens, then there was Rome. Then there was this, dark age of anarchy, then there was Europe, and then, we reached this kind of secular state of, approaching a telluric sort of utopia. That's completely misguided. Not because that's not how things work, but it's also there's not, yes, I agree with the postulate that Europe is the progeny of Athens and Rome, okay, in a basic sense. Okay, but that doesn't mean that across 40,000 years of man as we know him existing in anatomical and behavioral terms, that there's just been some ongoing process of of development towards some sort of utopian ambition, and that the people engaged in this process are self-consciously the inheritors of what came before, just in an abstract sense. So that's the issue. And the problem is, again, and this is the reason why I raised Schmidt contra Hobbes is because like I said, it's kind of like it's like Schmidt made the point implicitly, although not like he did overtly in political theology, but his whole point was that like Hobbes basically understood like authority and what gives rise to sovereign authority, like in conceptual terms and in epistemic terms, but because he removed essentially pre-rational explanations for human behavior at scale politically, what he was left with was okay, well this must be like a series of discrete decisions in aggregate, some of which are subconscious, some of which are very deliberate, whereby drawing upon rationality, humans can find ways to either to kind of like improve their material lot as well as to diminish the possibility of being wiped out by their enemies and things like this, but that's another aspect of the historicist viewpoint. Like it's not, I mean like a crude caricature, but it's not like Athens or the Tigris-Euphrates River civilization or like the Mongol Empire. It didn't come about because in some primordial setting, like guys are like, hey, I'm going to agree to a non-aggression pact with you, and hey, let's think up a language, and then like let's do this. I mean, I'm being silly, but it's like the origins of human political life and the origins of human identity. I mean, these things are mysterious. Like where does it come from? Like you can't explain that in rationalist terms or in some, and you can't model it. Okay, I mean, so that's part of why there's this sort of like strange, there's sort of like this strange kind of incoherence, even to even to American intellectuals, kind of in the Russell Kirk vein, because on the one hand they are God centric, but they're also like colored by this kind of like rationalist tendency, and they won't like abide the kind of metaphysical aspects of these things, as well as accepting that the process of culture becoming culture, then developing into a later form of what's been called civilization, and then like inevitable decline, like that can't really be explained. I can make the point to people like the Spanish Empire is sort of coming apart at the seams and just imploding when it was by far when it was by far the richest in material terms major power. Like they were stacking gold, literally like bricks of gold on top of each other. But it's like, okay, I mean, that doesn't, you can't buy your way out of civilizational decline, any more than you can like, any more than a man can like buy himself out of ill health, in absolute terms. I realize there's a lot there. I wasn't too scattered, but it's a very complicated matter.
I think the development of language is a very good example to show the differences in ways of thinking. And I guess I would say between the analytic and more continental views of these things. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, although he calls himself a leftist, like it's quite obvious that Chomsky is more on the side of the Anglo tradition. I mean, he's trying to find this universal grammar, this universal thing which ties people together, this analytical thing which we can define and pick apart, whereas the continental side of things, and I think this is where we might find some crossover, despite the fact that they're seen as contrary to each other quite a lot, and they obviously were in their personal lives, but that's a different question. Between Schopenhauer and Hegel, where Schopenhauer might say that there's this will that comes out of all life, and there is this will that wills languages and all these sorts of things. They didn't, like you said, they didn't sit down and like decide to do economics or decide to do language. And it's very similar to Hegel's view of history, where he sees history as just this inevitable process that is continually pushing forward by virtue of itself. Which again brings the the will as the thing as itself. I think there's a lot more crossover than we might give it credit for there. I don't know if I have anything to comment on there, but I would like to dig into LeftHegelianism. So that's, they call themselves the young Hegelians, and they ended up with Marx, and then also you have the, I guess, and then again this is the interesting part where we can pick it apart and you can say where you disagree with people's conceptual ideas of it. You also have the Right-Hegelians, which you have the old Hegelians, which might have been a more conservative force in the Prussian state very specifically. But I mean, I'm just picking this up because you yourself have called yourself a Right-Hegelian. We've already mentioned that in some historical views, the sort of showdown between the forces of left and right Hegelianism happened in Stalingrad. It's very obvious which forces I'm talking about if I say that particular war. But I guess this is my question for you: is, you know, you've called yourself a right Hegelian. What does that mean to you?
Essentially, that man is not in the driver's seat. You know, I mean, it's not. The traditional view is that things like war arrive like the seasons. You know, it's not this. It's neither this way of capturing, you know, economic benefits or. And what's fascinating about the Durham is that their only contribution to the rationalist enterprise, you know, was Clausewitz, and Clausewitz was a brilliant guy, and there's a lot to derive from there. But like, war is not just this kind of like rational process of politics, but with violence instead of negotiation. You know, I mean, at all. Like, it doesn't, you know, and that's the traditionally understood view, is, again, like, war arrives like the seasons. But I mean, obviously, the most intense iteration of political activity is warfare. I mean, there's a lot preceding that. There's a lot between, you know, absence of any sort of interdependence, you know, between two self-identified populations and warfare. You know, and again, what if you look at, again, you know, if you accept that the cunning of reason, which, you know, is a shorthand for providence, and which man comes to know through his capacity to reason and know in whatever limited way the mind of God, if that in fact is the prime mouvant in history, you can't look at the modern state and say something like this is wrongly configured. You know, so a state like Prussia, at its developmental zenith, you know, under Bismarck or whatever. I'm gonna use the word conventional in lieu of traditional because that confuses things. A conventional Hegelian in the epoch and later would look at that as, you know, this is a highly developed manifestation of a cultural form, you know, that developed through the hand of providence. Okay. Anybody who postulates that providential causes are the proximate causes as well as the absolute cause of history, you can't really look at that and say, like, we need reform. You know, man needs to intervene any way he can, you know, to change the developmental course of public life or of you know, sociological organization, you know, because the system is configured, you know, that's the system that is precedented, and its configuration is somehow wrong. You know, so I made the point to people before that Hegel's not axiomatically right wing in the sense we think of it, but it favors the traditional view of politics, not capital T tradition. I mean, like, the conventional view of politics. Because if you're a left Hegelian, you're not actually a Hegelian. Like, what you're doing is you're making ontological claims about human life and organizational tendencies at scale, and you're saying that all kinds of things cause this that have nothing to do with the cunning of reason. It has to do with, you know, it has to do with productive forces that, you know, ultra identitarian structures, and, you know, force conflicts that become inevitable, you know, based upon, you know, certain inequitable features of those emergent structures that can't be reconciled by peaceful means. Okay. Basically, that position is that, like, man is kind of just like the architect of political life, and that his purpose is some kind of combination of, you know, conflict resolution at scale and you know, developing ways to guard the purported dignity of man, you know, and that's not just contra Hegel, that's literally the opposite of Hegelian thought, you know. So that's kind of my point. And like it gets like it gets confused. It's not like Hegel's not it's not like talking about like Nietzsche or something where it's like, oh, Foucault is like a left-wing Nietzschean, and a guy a guy like my mind's blanking. Anthony Ludovici is like a right Nietzschean. Okay, like Hegel can't be approached like that. He's a totally different kind of thinker, and again, like the the what he was discussing, like kind of the guts of his metaphysics is something that's like beyond that kind of thing. And say that either like you accept it or you don't. There's not some iteration of it. Oh well, I've got a production force determinist like view of history, but I also believe in God. It's like, and I also believe that in providential causes of these things.
Yeah,
that's the short answer. There's a lot there.
Yeah. So in that sense, I mean, myself and a lot of people will be confused about this because it sounds like when we say left-Hegelian and right-Hegelian, it's not really like well, it is sort of two interpretations of the same thing, but it sounds like the right-Hegelian, which actually is, in your view, more congruent with what Hegel was actually trying to put forward, is a more particularist view of human history, but also sees that history as being driven primarily by providence. It does not put man in the driver's seat like the left-Hegelians do. And in the sense that you were saying that left-Hegelians, and Marx specifically, is flipping Hegel on his head by putting man in the driver's seat and making the Hegelian historical system more universalist, as opposed to the right-Hegelians who might have a more particularist view of individual ethnoses of man. Is that correct?
No, 100%. And the reason why it might seem superficially confusing, but the reason I raise the analogy of Schmidt contra Hobbes, because on the one hand, like Schmidt was very much a Hobbesian, in terms of the ontology of political life, like how man like views authority, in literally theological terms. The role of the sovereign as being an agent who acts literally outside the constitutional order. It's the basis of sovereignty is that the sovereign is not bound, by the constitutional structure. Like quite literally everything he does in a sovereign capacity is exceptional, not exceptional in colloquial terms, but exceptional in constitutional terms. And but Hobbes's entire paradigm is based on this idea that man is this, is this kind of like isolated integer, and he's just like born as this like individual who then, enters into a kind of non-aggression pact with others out of self-interest and the basic necessity of mitigating violence, and then from there, like other agreements are reached in kind, like relating to that basic need for security, and thus, the kind of highest iteration of this agreement between these like individual actors, who kind of are born in splendid isolation of one another, just as like discrete and singularly like self-contained individuals, is kind of like the agreement on the need for a sovereign. Like Schmidt's whole point is that no, you're born to a pre-rational identity, which is existential in nature, and which literally dictates like how like the outcome not just of your life but of the entire nation, tribe, civilization that you belong to. There's nothing to do with like individual volitional decisions. There's nothing to do with people like making like conscious choices in the interest of self-preservation. However, like within Schmidt's paradigm, he accepts 100% what Hobbes suggested about the sovereign, about Leviathan, but it's the origins of Leviathan similarly are totally different. We were talking about Schmidt's kind of ontology, but again, Schmidt was 100% in dialogue with Hobbes, and Hobbes was a necessary precursor in conceptual terms to Schmitt. And Hegel was an essential precursor to Marx. But again, we're talking about when I talk about the essentiality of these things, I'm saying that Marxism, like everything else, was literally in dialogue, oppositional or otherwise, with Hegelian thought. So I mean that means like Hegelian concepts were defining not just discursive space, but the totality of European intellectual life. Even if the people in question we're talking about were reacting against Hegelian claims. So yeah, it gets confusing, but it's not a distinction without difference. Like we just addressed. Like there's not this like body of philosophy called Hegel, and there's like a right wing interpretation of it and a left wing. It's like left Hegelianism is a repudiation of it. It's like Schmitt's it's Schmitt's view of like the Hobbesian Leviathan. Okay. Yeah.
That clarifies a lot for someone like me. And like I said, I think a lot of people listening will be in the same boat on the outside of stuff. We are getting incredibly technical with this, but I think it's important to flag up that this left-right Hegelian distinction, at least this is my impression now. I mean, interrupt me if I'm talking nonsense here.
Oh, no, you're 100% right. Yeah. Well, we also get, I mean, that's one of the problems with. Yeah, no, go ahead.
I just wanted to cap that off by saying it sounds like the distinction is actually a larger and more important thing than merely, Right-Hegelianism is the Third Reich and LeftHegelianism is Marx and Sovietism.
Oh no, 100%, and especially in the case of especially in the case of the Third Reich. I mean, definitely the epistemic priors in the minds of not just Adolf Hitler, but most of the core of the party, their model of German government historically was Prussia, and that suggests kind of like an axiomatic Hegelianism. But yeah, it was not. One can't just say like, this was the source of National Socialist thought, and yeah, like the way the Soviet Union developed also, I mean, was peculiar. I mean, don't get me wrong. Like the Soviet Union was a Marxist state. The DDR was even more so, and like pure terms. This idea that people who should know better, this idea that the Soviet Union wasn't really Marxist. It absolutely was. There's discrete like identitarian, organic, and cultural, sociological features which will always kind of shape the configuration of the regime no matter what it is premised upon. But yeah, we can't just reduce things to these kinds of like partisan paradigms. And plus, like right and left is like I think it was somewhat meaningless, really, even by the inner warriors. What I mean is like after the Great War, like it's not. That's why like there's. I mean, it's foolish people who are always like, oh, the Third Reich was socialist. It was actually left wing. Like that's literally retarded, but it's kind of unintentionally expressing an important point. Like the NSDAP was like a self-identified party of the right in kind of the common lingua franca of 20th century politics. But like right and left doesn't really have meaning unless you're literally talking about something like the Jacobin Revolution, where you've got people defending a truly primordial, generally they're not axiomatically like monarchic order, and people on contra that saying no, progress as well as the dignity of the individual requires that we overthrow this and replace it with something more equitable. Like you can't like it's not it's not it doesn't lend itself to these kinds of tautologies. But no, you're absolutely right, man.
So this is moving a little bit off the topic of Hegel, but just off of what you've just said, I think it's worth talking about it. I've written a little bit about this on my Substack, just trying to make sense of everything. And I think I will expand on this at some point, but I basically got an essay called What is Rightism? And my essential point in that essay is that, and this is kind of even like a hack thing to say because it almost gets into like culture war territory, you know, but it's obvious that that spectrum is inadequate, like you've suggested. You know, maybe it was inadequate during the 20th century, but to be frank with you, like the left-right spectrum has its roots in the house of the French Revolution. You have the Girondins versus the Jacobins, the forces of revolution. One sat on the left side, one sat on the right side. The right side, you know, would have to be something like classical liberalism, and the other side was a more, I guess we would say leftist, but I guess Jacobin is a fine way of putting it. But I suppose, what do you kind of make of that? That kind of theory of mind? Do you think it makes sense, or how would you expand on that?
Oh no, yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are, so like the Supreme Court's like said famously about pornography in the 80s. I think it was Rehnquist. He said, no, I can't like define pornography, but I know it when I see it. And people thought that was funny. It's like, okay, like I can't sit here and like define the right wing for you. And again, too, I think it's a dubious way of marking something out, but I do know it when I see it. Okay, I mean, it's like, and that's as in that capacity, like, yeah, it's useful in kind of general terms. But when people set about to sort of like develop this kind of like categorical understanding of what is left wing or right wing, and according to like discrete criteria that they're listing out. And again, this comes back to the fixation with being able to model things, whether it's in what in sociological endeavors, and economics is one of those. Okay, but but yeah, it's and it's also too it was exacerbated by the fact that, I mean, dialectical materialism is nonsense. Like the class paradigm that is purported in Das Kapital and what have you. I mean, that's not reality, and that's not and it's anthropologically laughable. But at the same time, class hostility like was a real thing, and this kind of discrete class of unskilled industrial laborers, who the cities were teeming with, and then this kind of like caste that became this kind of like this kind of bourgeois caste that used to not be particularly well off in terms of their ability to assert power or in terms of the wealth they controlled. Like suddenly these people were like more powerful than a king, like with that, like, so stuff like that, is characteristic of modern ideological constellations. But like again, that has no relevance anymore because the paradigm is described like no longer exists. Okay, so it's like, so like, what is left wing? Is it you're really into guarding the the alleged dignity of gay people? Like, does it mean that does it mean that you believe in like a welfare state? Like, does it mean that you consume these kinds of these media brands? Like it doesn't really. I mean, yeah, like don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to be totally obtuse to be like what is politics, but it's the and there are recurring kind of like prime symbols and things that people associate with the left, and there's like animating mythologies from preceding centuries that like play into the kind of political romanticism of these things. But yeah, it's kind of a meaningless paradigm anymore. And also in the European, in the continental versus the American, and to a lesser degree like the UK situation, like this idea that like in America, this idea that, like socialism or like big government is this like axiomatically like left wing structure, and it exists to kind of play off like these like non-white client populations or these allegedly like disenfranchised populations against a purported hostile majority. Like that's not like nobody on the continent thinks about like socialism like in those terms. You know, like I always direct people like Werner Sombart and George Sorel, but it's, you know, I don't think you can say like Bismarck was a liberal because he provided old age pensions to people. You know, like I mean, it's not
Yeah.
something that's like that too. You know, it's just not a good way of describing political realities, especially in America, and especially not anywhere in 2023.
Yeah. That know it when you see it. That's just a perfect way of putting it, and it's not a way I thought about it before. It's very interesting because it almost suggests the philosophical underpinning to this. Because know it when you see it is almost a deontological, like philosophical position. Like it just is inherently in the thing, possibly more continental. It's just in the will, it's in the expression of the thing. Whereas, the analytic mind, the Anglo mind, wants to pick things apart and make things consequential, wants to look
And
at metrics.
yeah.
And wants to also, I mean, just to give an example, I mean, like, to say what is a inclusive society, what's a liberal one, where it's one where, software developers are exactly 50% women and 50% men or something like that. It wants to go in and make a spreadsheet out of everything. And I mean, just to relate that to the 20th century example is, people do this all the time. They pick apart things that the Third Reich did and the things that the Soviets did and say, oh, this means that the Soviets were racist or blah, 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 blah. But what's almost more important to us as human beings is almost the aesthetic quality. Like there is an aesthetic fascism. Like
No, I was about to mention that.
I mean,
it's also, no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Working man in the army.
No, that's and yeah, it's not just no, you're absolutely right. It is an aesthetical phenomenon. And it's also the like symbolic psychology is tremendously impactful on human affairs and particularly politics. And that's an understated thing. Like the prime symbols of a political orientation, that draws upon, primordial impulses tending towards how the human mind comes to associate objects and certain and certain and certain symbols and the way the senses perceive them, associating those things with various emotional and intellectual states, the way people identify things as existing within the penumbra of something that's seems like right wing or left wing, or seems to honor God and what have you, and yeah, that's not superficial. Like Goebbels wrote a lot about that, and that's why and that's also too, like, look at the like the optics of the NSDAP, like the bright red flag, like it I mean, that's like red, like, does stir people's passions, like silly as that might sound to people. And then there's a reason why, like, the communists like marched under the red banner. They didn't march under the gray banner. Like, they didn't march under the like light blue banner. They marched under the blood red banner. And it's and yeah, the let's also too. I mean, look at the lunacy. I'm not talking about like the motives of the deep state types, but like the lunacy with relating to how these kinds of like media addled types of consumers and voters, like the way they respond to Donald Trump. Like, it really has nothing to do with Donald Trump the guy. Like, he symbolizes something to them as like an evil capitalist, or like like a mean rich guy, or like a crude media caricature who treats women not real nice, or I mean, like, none of this has much to do at all like with the man himself. And there's rare cases where it's kind of like messianic personage, somebody like a Hitler, like a Cromwell, like a Muhammad, like they transcend that because like there is a kind of like shaman energy to them and their discrete personality, as well as their ability to connect with their audience, like literally, in like a public speaking setting or a social setting or whatever. I mean, yeah, but that's the reason why they're exceptional, compared to their counterparts. As I mean, you understand what I mean. But yeah, no, that's that's a tremendously important and overlooked point, is the relationship of symbolic psychology to political orientation and commitment and all of that.
Yeah. So I just want to talk about sort of looking from contemporary times backwards. I mean, just to kind of give us a sketch, like today we live in a time of, you invoke the Spanish Empire, which is an interesting one, but we do live in a time of immense material wealth in the West. But there is a whimpering of the Occidental culture and a general Americanization of the zeitgeist. I'm just wondering what you think of how things have turned out in contemporary times, and also what happened in the 20th century. Like, what do you think Hegel would have made of it? Do you think he would have revised his theory at all based on that?
I mean, I think Hegel would have. I mean, the way the 20th century developed and the intensity of it, I made the point that it's something that literally occurs once every 1,000 years. Like, I'm not saying like that particular constellation of facts emerges at all, but I mean that kind of absolute sort of existential crisis, you know, of that touching concern kind of every aspect of man's of like a human ontology, and like, you know, it has political terms, but in, you know, like absolute terms. Nobody could really have predicted that. But I mean, I think Hegel wouldn't have been entirely surprised, you know, by the emergence of something like Marxism, which came to, you know, literally define the 20th century. You know, I mean, and I mean, it's in fact that what gave rise to this kind of these kinds of critical developments and this absolute like intractable hostility, you know, between the combatant states that can only result in the annihilation of one by the other. I mean, that's Hegelian. That's the Hegelian process writ large, and its most intensely sanguinary form. So I think that's probably the way he would have approached it. Like my own life, like I was telling our dear friend Keith Woods the other day when we recorded some stuff down in Nashville. It like I thought personally, you know, when I've been at this for, you know, 25 years, I figured I knew at some point there'd be some kind of corrective in terms of people developing like a basically like, you know, right wing consciousness as relates to these, you know, these kinds of national shibboleths. But I figured it would happen like long after I was dead. Okay, I figured like it would happen, you know, like, you know, maybe in the last couple of decades, like the 21st century or something. Like the rapidity and the scale of its emergence was very surprising. You know, so it's difficult to suss out such things, even if you're just like a, you know, whether it be like just like a regular person like me or like a towering figure like Hegel. So I mean that's the best kind of answer I can give to that. But yeah, you know, it's also too, I mean, forgive me, this is too tangential. The 20th century, again, to the point under discussion, was totally abnormal. Like now is the return kind of the status quo, at least in power political terms. You know, it's this idea that, oh, everything in the 20th century makes sense, and we can orient ourselves according to like these different pole stars. But now everything's in anarchy. That's not true at all. The internal situation in the United States is a mess, but it's, I mean, honestly, I mean, it's the more the regime fails, and America's the American regime is not going to totally isn't going to cease to exist for another couple hundred years. It's going to die by 1,000 cuts. But there's not going to be like a November 9th, 1989 moment, you know, here. But the what the hell was I gonna the but it's the emergence of a kind of like more robust discourse on, you know, what the purpose of politics is and how those ambitions can be accomplished with respect to the configuration of authority. I say authority, not state. The state system's on its way out, and that's not some perennial permanent thing either. Okay, like I emphasize that to people, but my point was to bring it back. You can't look at where we are now in 2023 as this totally unforeseen thing for which there was no precedent at all. You know, and again, history doesn't repeat itself, but we're talking about human social organization at scale. There are common variables which, you know, can, you know, that do facilitate, you know, not you know, like an absolute ability to model history, but it does, you know, confer a certain predictability upon to it. And you know, I think because the regime does not have this absolute bully pulpit like they did through terrestrial media, you know, at the real rich to the zenith, you know, in the very early 90s. There's not, the world is not divided, you know, between you know, two camps, you know, who are always kind of on the brink of war to determine, you know, like what globalism is going to look like. Like, I mean, those are totally abnormal things, and they also restrict the ability. They restrict the parameters of discursive space, you know, just by the nature of the occurrences we're talking about and the kind of zeitgeist that emerges out of those occurrences. There's a lot. One of the reasons why, you know, our position is blown up is because just by virtue of the fact that now there actually is discursive space there wasn't before, and it's not just the internet. The internet's a huge part of that, but it's just like everything has changed in the way people associate politically, where the rubber meets the road in terms of discursive activity. And I firmly believe that. And I spend a lot of my time just traveling around the country, like meeting our peoples face to face and seeing what they're doing. Yeah, so I'm not just basing my take on like something I saw on YouTube or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess off the back of that point there, I mean, like, what is the future for whatever this rightist impulse is? Like, what is, in your view, what is rightism in the 21st century? Because is it, you know, going to have its place in continued containment, which I think it has for a long time, or what sort of the
what
future?
I think the future is I mean, the future of people like us is like, I mean, in practical terms, is nullification. You know, like our path forward is to secede as much as possible from regime culture and its, you know, the reach of its bureaucracies. And I'm not saying like go be a survivalist and don't pay your taxes or something. But what I'm saying is that you can secede from those structures today in a way that you just could not before. And kind of congruous with that, moving forward, there's, in America at least, the paradigm's going to be like people who are the resistance, like us, and people who are regime loyal. Okay. And increasingly, you know, especially among like youngsters, like right and left isn't going to have any meaning.
Yeah.
It's going to be, yeah, it's, you know, and it's going to be the resistance, and there's going to be the regime, you know, or in Europe, probably in a place like France, it's going to be, you know, it's going to be identitarians of various colors, you know, including the Muslim minority. And I'm not talking about whether they should be there or not. That I don't want to get into that. Okay, obviously, I'm not in favor of them being there. What I'm saying is that they will play a part in saying, no, fuck you, I'm not French, I'm a Muslim, or like, you know, and there will, you know, and a critical mass of actually French people saying, you know, no, I'm not a European, I'm not a Christian Democrat, you know, I'm you know, I'm a Frenchman, you know, and that that's there's, you know, like civic identity was like propositional identity was always like a contrivance in Europe, but it's going to be kind of nobody's going to like put on airs like that anymore. But that's, you know, but like I said, I don't have any great insight into the continent. I'm not European, and I don't, you know, it's not like I spend time there or something. But yeah, I think identitarian versus you know, people who you know, people are truly like rootless, like not just cosmopolitan people. I mean, people who just kind of like live without culture and without any kind of like inner life. You know, they're who are kind of just like we're just kind of like the dead weight to like the regime. You know, seeks out the clientage of, you know, to especially as its mandate recedes. But it's going to be, yeah, it's going to be the resistance aspect, the resistance element versus the aspects of the body politic still loyal to the regime, like, which is a diminishing portion of the population, I might add. That's my kind of quick take on that. I'm so tired from my trip. There's like a Fast and Furious it was incredible going to Nashville. But like, so if I'm rambling, I'm sorry. I'm still kind of tired.
No, I think we've done a pretty good job today, and especially considering my lack of knowledge on Hegel, I want to give like a special acknowledgement to people I'm very close to who are way more clued up on Hegel, who did converse with me on this to help me out with this. So I really appreciate that. They know who they are. And so I want to just wrap this up by asking you, Thomas, what's up with the cat?
Like I like Felix the cat. Like I'm always making the point of people that like other than Christ, kind of like my holy trifecta is like Elvis Presley, you know, an Austrian painter, and Felix the cat. And like when you guys are like riffing on me about whether I'm like a alpha or like a beta or like a sigma, like, I don't know that, but like I said, I'm like a cat with a magic bag, like Felix the cat. So just, you know, I'm an unrepentant harlequin, man. Like I'm not afraid to laugh at myself. I realize there's like some silly shit about me, so I'm just like riffing on that. It's just silly bullshit. Yeah.
Yeah, as a Brit, I'd not heard of Felix the cat before. It reminds me of like a classic, like Mickey Mouse sort of.
Yeah. But like, there's like a weirdness to old Felix the cat reels that like it's kind of like that's but it's just my kind of weirdo sense of humor.
Yeah, and I think at least the public jury was pretty unanimous that you're a Sigma. So
yeah, I don't run from it. It's okay.
Cool. Right. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you, Samuel. Anytime. Always an honor and a pleasure to hold these conversations.